Okay, so if we move to the content, I'm sure most of you are aware of the ICH initiative, and one of the big things out of that was this Common Technical Document Format, CTD. In the past, Europe had their own way of organizing an application, US had their own way, Japan had their own way. So those three markets got together and said, let's at least have the same table of contents, if you will, where industry can put this information in one spot. So basically, it is a TOC. It did not harmonize 100% on content, but it did harmonize on how we organize it. So you're going to want your DMF to be organized according to the CTD structure, and I'll go into that a little bit more. But more detailed content of what the FDA is expecting, there's an FDA drug substance guidance. It's rather old, but it does still have some nuggets of information of what they are expecting, and they certainly haven't withdrawn it, so they're still relying on that guidance document. So, and other guidance, so other more technical guidance also came under ICH, International Conference of Harmonization. I've listed a few here. There are a lot of different topics under ICH, and they weren't all just quality. The Q stands for quality. There are also, I assume, clinical. I don't go into those too much, but I'm sure there's a whole series of clinical ICH documents. So these are good references for technically what they're expecting to see in these CTD sections. Q1 series is around stability testing. The Q2 series is around methods validation. The Q3 series is around impurities, including residual solvents. The Q4B is around specifications. So again, we're going to want to follow the ICH Common Technical Document structure. For a DMF, these are the modules that are applicable for a DMF. Module 1, which includes your administrative information. Module 2, which is a quality overall summary, or QOS, and Module 3, which is your detailed quality information. Now, in a DMF, we actually only use part of Module 3. There's a whole another part of Module 3 for drug product that obviously a DMF would not use. I'm sure many of you have seen this triangle from ICH. Here's Module 1 at the top. I can't even read it from here. Module 2, and we're going to be working down kind of the left-hand side of the triangle. You're going to have your table of contents, but here's the quality overall summary down here. Obviously, for a DMF, you're not going to have a non-clinical or clinical overview or summary. And as you work down to Module 3, here's our quality section. Obviously, we're not going to have a Module 4 for non-clinical reports or a Module 5 for clinical reports. And then even within Module 3, we can divide this, and the DMF only has the drug substance part of the Module 3 and not the drug product. So then Module 1, obviously, for a complete submission, a complete NDA or ANDA, the Module 1 is more comprehensive than in a DMF. So over the years working with Regis included in doing these DMFs, we've kind of teased out what sections we really need to submit for a DMF. So obviously a comprehensive table of contents. They like to call their cover letter a transmittal letter. I'm not sure why. And there are very specific rules around how you title your cover letters. They want to know specifically, is this an administrative change? Is this an original submission? If it's an original submission, what's the subtype and the further subtype? There's a lot of categories, and again, it's on the website. But just to be aware that it don't just say "Dear FDA," ramble about what you've done. They need a summary, quick at the top of what this is that they're looking at. Administrative information, the names and addresses of the DMF holder, the corporate office, manufacturing facility if it's different, or if you have two manufacturing facilities, who the contact is for the FDA, whether it be for inspection or a deficiency letter, and if you have any agents with your DMF. The responsibilities of each person that might be listed above, and here's the statement of commitment that needs to be signed saying, this is what we're doing. We promise to let you know and our applicants know if we make any changes. They do want an environmental assessment, but it's not the typical environmental assessment like a drug product would have. This is more that our site follows environmental regulations. It's the actual component impact on the environment is done at the ANDA level or the NDA level. And here's this letter of authorization. If it's your initial submission, you won't have this yet because you won't have your DMF number yet unless you're doing an electronic submission. So typically what I do is if there's no letters of authorization yet, I put at least a placeholder there that these will be sent when when these are available. And then they also want a separate listing of all they call it persons, but it's all the companies that you have authorized to refer to the DMF. So this would be a place that you could have 10 listed, you could have 5, and this is a list that you need to maintain going forward. And I think I put little notes here for me to make sure. Let's see. I feel like there was something else that I came across. I wanted to mention, a debarment certification. You may want to include this here in Module 1. If you're supporting an ANDA, your ANDA client will definitely ask for one from you because they will need to include that in their Module 1. So if you want to just go ahead and include it in your DMF, that would just be helpful. You kill 2 birds. And if you also are relying on a DMF within your DMF, for maybe you're using somebody to manufacture an intermediate, you might want to get that debarment certification from this intermediate manufacturer. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with what a debarment certification is. I also noticed, and I haven't typically supplied these in DMS before, but they are asking for a label. I am assuming it's the label that you would put on your drum when you ship the material. I haven't done that yet, but it is something that did appear in their checklist. If you were doing a complete ANDA or NDA, there's a lot of other things that go in your Module 1, the complete prescribing information, more thorough environmental assessment, patent certifications, all kinds of things. Module 2, also known as the Quality Overall Summary. Again, I'm referring you to this ICH CTD guidance, and it goes through section by section what the kinds of information they expect to see in the Module 2, as well as the Module 3. It's one guidance document that covers Module 2 and Module 3. It basically just summarizes the technical information that you've presented in Module 3. And no information should be presented in Module 2 that is not also in Module 3. It really should be a summary. The FDA used to not require these types of summaries, but when we went through the ICH harmonization initiative, Europe was very big into a summary, and they used to have an outside person critically evaluate their technical information, and they had a form that they needed to fill out and say that, yeah, this is valid, this makes sense, I'm in agreement with what this firm has done in terms of development. And in Europe, that was a tool that really the reviewers went to first. They went to this summary, and then if they had questions, they would spread out to Module 3. It wasn't called Module 3 at the time, but more of the detail. Whereas the FDA always just dug into the detail. So this is kind of, I think, a compromise, having this Module 2 because of Europe's preference for a summary type of document. In my opinion, I don't think that the FDA really goes much to the Module 2. I think they dive right into the Module 3. So now if we get to the Module 3, this is your detailed quality section. And again, I've referenced this same guidance. It contains information on Module 2 and Module 3. But for Type 2 DMF, the following sections are applicable. There's 3.2S, which is for the drug substance. There's a 3.2R, which is regional information. But this regional information is largely not applicable to a drug substance. It would be more for drug product. Executed batch records. I have never submitted an executed batch record for a drug substance, certainly for a drug product. A methods validation package, not usually submitted in the DMF. That's usually the applicant needs to provide all that method validation information, even for the API. Comparability protocols, not usually submitted in the DMF because there's no review and approval of a DMF. What companies use a comparability protocol for is to reduce their reporting requirement for a change. So since you're a DMF and you just submit all your amendments, there's no review and approval, this doesn't really buy you much. If you know that you're going to make some kind of change and you're working with your applicant, you may want to work with your applicant and say, we're thinking of adding a new site for this intermediate or for the final API. Maybe we can work together and put a comparability protocol in to your ANDA, and that would reduce their reporting mechanism potentially. So instead of waiting for a prior approval, or instead of filing as a prior approval supplement, maybe they could get a reduced requirements, and so they submit it as a CBE, so it can be implemented quicker. So that might be something to consider if you know that you've got something down the line that you want to change. That would have a big impact on your applicant. So the other sections, there's a 3.2P section, which is for the drug product. There's also a 3.2A, which are appendices, which are usually not even really used for drug products as well. So if we go in a little more deeper then into this 3.2S, the first section is general information, and this is where you outline the nomenclature, the structure, the general properties, what's the solubility, do we need to be concerned about polymorphs, things like that would go in this section. The 3.2S2 section is the manufacturer section, and this is where it's a pretty big section, and this is primarily where your proprietary information is, all in this section. You're going to describe who's manufacturing, who's doing testing, who's doing stability testing. You'll need, if you have an outside lab doing testing on one of your components, you'll need to list them. You'll have a description of your manufacturing process and process controls. You'll need to talk about your control of materials. What are your specifications for your starting material, for your reagents? How are you testing them? And control of your critical steps and intermediates. What are your isolated intermediates? How are you testing those? What are the specifications? Process validation and or evaluation is usually not applicable unless you're a sterile API. You may need to, if you are a sterile API, you'll probably need to include some information about your environmental controls and how you guarantee that your API is actually sterile. But for a standard synthesis, this is usually not required. And then a little piece on your manufacturing process development, particularly if you've made changes, and what is the impact on your impurity profile? Are you using residual solvents or different residual solvents? This is more critical if you're in a pure development and you're doing clinical trials and tox studies on a new chemical entity where you've used a certain API for those studies, and now you've made some changes, and maybe you have different impurities, a different impurity profile. How do you make sure that you link back to that those tox studies and the clinical trials are still valid with your new API? So that's the bridge you want to try to bridge for that. For more generic type of APIs, how did you bring that manufacturing into your facility? What kind of what did you find to be critical? What are you controlling? Why were those critical? And are your controls sufficient to make sure the final quality is consistent? The next section is your characterization section, elucidation of structure and other characteristics. For a more generic API, a simple IR scan versus the USP, reference standard may be all you need, but for a new chemical entity, you'll certainly need more studies, NMR studies, more characterization of your material. And then a list of your impurities, and these need to be all potential, not just what you're seeing, but just based on the chemistry, what is a potential impurity, including residual solvents. So even if you're not seeing it in your final API, FDA still wants a description of what's possible, and have you really looked for it? How do you know it's really not there? There's a pretty renewed focus on genotoxic impurities as well, so depending on what you're using in your manufacturing process, is there a potential for a genotoxic impurity to surface? Just the potential. If the potential is there, they want to know about it, and they want to know if you consider it genotoxic. If it's potentially genotoxic and you're showing that it's not there, that's okay, but you need to do the studies to show that it's not there. And I think we've used a calculation, I think it was originally based on a European guidance. If you're below, you can show that you're below 30% of the threshold of toxicological concern, then you have a pretty good case for not continuing to test these materials. But certainly, method development to get a method that's capable of detecting down to that level could be a whole, research project itself. If we move to 32S4, control of drug substance, this is where you will identify, provide your specification and all your analytical procedures for that API, the complete validation of your analytical procedures. If you are a compendial API and you're following the USP methods, you still need to do a verification of those analytical procedures. You can't just say, well, it's USP, I'm doing it, and you're good to go. You need to do some level of verification that the procedure is working in your lab with your particular API. Batch analysis is expected. Usually the rule of thumb is 3 batches. I've never seen it where you've needed 3 full-scale batches. These can be pilot scale. Certainly, and we'll get into this a little bit later, if you have some full-scale data, that gives you a lot more comfort with everything else you're committing to, and the DMF is actually going to hold true when you scale up. And then your justification of specification. This could include reasons why you're not testing for certain impurities or certain residual solvents. So it's important to discuss what you are testing and why you're testing it, but there may also be some test items that you're not conducting, and you should explain why you're not conducting those tests. 32S5 reference standards or materials. Again, if you're a compendial API, probably a printout of the USP COA that you get with your reference standard is adequate. But if you're qualifying your own API based on that reference standard, how are you qualifying your reference standard? How are you testing it? Certainly for a new chemical entity, they want to know what are you doing to your API to make it a reference standard for you. What's that process? And then how are you testing it? And they usually want to see at least an NMR test on your reference standard just to confirm the structure. 32S container closure system. What's particularly your primary contact material? Some companies like to also try to submit a DMF reference for that container closure system. Just a description. They usually want a comment that it meets at least food grade requirements. And then lastly, 32S7 is the stability section. They want a summary of the stability data that you have to date. They want a retest period proposed or stated in this section. If you have not done full-scale batches, if this is on pilot scale material or maybe a scale-up, they're going to want a commitment that you are going to put 3 full-scale batches up on stability and monitor that and report the data as it comes available. If you've already done 3 full-scale batches, then you're done. And then there's also a it's kind of a misnomer for DMF. It's not really a post-approval. It's never approved. But there's an expectation that you're putting batches up yearly if you're manufacturing. So you need to commit to do that. I can go. I don't know if I'm running out of time, or I can just for completeness. This is the Module 3 drug product section. They the drug product folks have to include similar types of information. The composition. I'll just go over this really briefly. The composition of their drug product. 32P2 is their pharmaceutical development. So kind of like your manufacturing development. It's broken into more pieces. Are excipients compatible with the API? What was our manufacturing process development? Why did we select this type of manufacturing process versus another? Container closure system, why are we in the type of container that we are in? What data do we have that shows that it's protecting our finished product? Microbiological attributes, if required, and then compatibility. This is usually for like maybe a lyophilized product that you have to reconstitute. You have to show that it's compatible. 32P3, similar to the 32S2. They need to identify all of their manufacturers, their batch formula, how they're manufacturing, how they're controlling their process, and their process validation as well. This is a different section for the drug product. There's a whole section on control of excipients. Again, their specifications, their analytical procedures, why they're doing the tests that they're doing, do they have anything of animal origin, and is anything novel? And this may be a place where they would refer to another DMF for a particular exotic excipient. 32P5 would be similar to the 32S4. This would be for a drug product. Again, your specifications, your analytical procedures, your validations, batch analysis. Sometimes there are impurities that aren't inherent to the API. They might be coming from an interaction with an excipient, so there's a section for impurities that may be different than would be stated in the drug substance section. They also have a reference standards section that they need to include, because again, there may be different reference standards that they need to do just based on their particular drug product. Their 32P7 section is usually quite more advanced. Blisters, bottles, the vials, they definitely need DMF references for these materials, since the drug product is sitting in contact with these materials for could be a while. And then their stability section 32P8, same type of information is requested.